October 28, 1942. A Halifax bomber is on fire at 12,000 feet over the Norwegian fjords. The port wing is burning. The crew can see the flames reflected in the black water below. The pilot, a 23-year-old from Yorkshire, whose name almost no one will ever know, makes a decision in 4 seconds that takes 4 decades to understand. He holds the aircraft level. He does not bank. He does not dive. He holds it level and steady while his crew jumps one by one into the darkness above a lake called Heuklingen. Then the ice takes the aircraft. The lake swallows it whole. And for 31 years, nobody goes looking. That bomber did not belong there. According to the most powerful man in British Air Command, it should never have been built at all. According to official assessments, it was a compromise, a stopgap, and a liability dressed up as a warplane. According to Arthur Harris, Air Chief Marshal of Bomber Command, the resources being spent on it were a waste that could have gone to a better aircraft. The men dying in it were dying in an inferior machine. He said this in writing. He said it repeatedly. He had the authority to ground it, and almost did. He was wrong. By the end of the war, the aircraft he wanted scrapped had flown 82,773 bombing sorties, dropped 224,000 tons of ordnance, delivered more secret agents into occupied Europe than any other aircraft type in the Allied arsenal, towed the heaviest combat gliders ever built across the Rhine at dawn under fire, and jammed the radar systems that were killing the Lancaster crews Harris spent his career defending. 6,178 of them were built. Nearly all of them were scrapped within 2 years of the armistice. By 1995, not a single complete example survived on the surface of the Earth. The only way to find one was to go underwater. This is the story of the Handley Page Halifax, and it begins with a man that history never quite figured out how to celebrate. George Rudolf Volkert was not the kind of engineer who appeared in newspapers. He did not give speeches. He did not attend ceremonies if he could avoid them. He was born in Fulham in 1891, the son of a family with German roots, in a city that would within 2 decades be at war with Germany. He studied mechanical engineering at the Northampton Institute, where one of his lecturers was a man named Frederick Handley Page. When Volkert graduated in 1912, he walked into Handley Page's company and never left. Not for 36 years. Not for better offers. Not for prestige. He stayed because the work was there, and the work was what he understood. By the time the First World War ended, Volkert had already designed the O/400, a heavy bomber so effective that for years afterward, the British military used the phrase, a Handley Page, as a synonym for any large aircraft. The name of the company became the category. That does not happen to mediocre engineers. Between the wars, he designed the HP-42 airliners for Imperial Airways, enormous stately biplanes that carried passengers above the deserts of the Middle East and the plains of Africa on schedules that, given the technology of the era, were almost miraculous. He understood large aircraft the way a shipwright understands hulls. He understood their weight distribution, their structural language, the invisible conversation between mass and lift that determines whether a machine survives or fails at altitude over a hostile city at 2 in the morning. When the Air Ministry issued Specification P. 1336 in 1936, calling for a new long-range heavy bomber, Volkert was the obvious choice. The specification was clean on paper. The aircraft needed to cruise at no less than 275 miles per hour, reach 15,000 feet, and carry a meaningful bomb load across significant distances. All submissions were to be designed around twin engines. Volkert drew up a design he called the HP-56. It was efficient, sensibly proportioned, and aerodynamically coherent. Then he read the fine print. The Air Ministry had specified the Rolls-Royce Vulture as the power plant. The Vulture was a 24-cylinder X-configuration engine that looked extraordinary on a specification sheet and came apart in operational service. Rolls-Royce was still fighting its internal engineering demons. Oil contamination, chronic overheating, bearing failures that arrived without warning and left without explanation. The Vulture consumed itself from within, and Volkert knew it. He submitted the HP-56 as instructed because that was what the contract required. But privately, he had already begun to doubt whether this aircraft would survive long enough to matter. Avro had made the same bet. Their Manchester bomber was built entirely around the Vulture, and by 1941 it was already being pulled from frontline operations. Crews were dying in it. Not from enemy action. From engine failure over England, over the North Sea, over targets they had not yet reached. The engine that was supposed to power the next generation of RAF bombers was killing the men assigned to fly behind it. The Air Ministry recognized the danger in July of 1937, which was either impressively quick or unforgivably slow, depending on how you count the dead. They instructed Handley Page to abandon the twin-engine layout entirely. The new specification called for 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, a larger airframe, a longer fuselage, a greater wingspan. The HP-56 would become the HP-57. The aircraft would grow into something that had not quite been planned and not quite been imagined, and the compromises embedded in that growth would cost lives before they were fixed. Volkert adapted. He was too professional not to. But the expansion of the design introduced structural tensions that would not become visible until men were dying over Germany in the dark. The fuselage proportions that had made sense for the original twin-engine variant were not optimal for the heavier, faster machine now being demanded. The tail surfaces had to manage forces they had not been designed to manage. And the triangular fin configuration, which looked clean and geometric in the drawings, behaved in ways that no drawing could fully predict at altitude in violent maneuver. The first prototype serial number, L7244, lifted off from RAF Bicester on the 25th of October, 1939. Britain had been at war for 7 weeks. The test pilot was Jim Cordes, and for safety reasons, the undercarriage was locked in the down position throughout the maiden flight. The aircraft flew. It was controllable. Handley Page allowed themselves a moment of cautious optimism. Then the second prototype, which was far more representative of what the production aircraft would actually be, began to reveal everything the first flight had hidden. The Halifax entered service with 35 Squadron in November of 1940. Its first bombing operation came in March of 1941, a raid on Le Havre. Then Hamburg. Then Kiel. Then the heavily defended industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley, where German flak batteries had been trained for years, and where the Luftwaffe's night fighter force was growing more lethal with every passing month by 1942. The flaws that Volkert had feared began to manifest with consequences that were no longer theoretical. The aircraft was underpowered. The Merlin engines that performed magnificently in the Spitfire and the Hurricane, where every pound of thrust was working against a light airframe, were being asked to haul a machine nearly 3 times as heavy to altitudes it could barely reach. Fully loaded, the Halifax struggled to climb above 20,000 feet. Bomber Command needed altitude to survive. The higher you flew, the harder you were to hit, the harder you were to intercept, the more margin you had when things went wrong. The Halifax could not provide it. And then there was the tail. In a hard banking dive, the kind of desperate evasive maneuver that pilots called a corkscrew, performed at night with a night fighter closing from behind the triangular rudder fins, could overbalance. The feedback through the pedals reversed. The aircraft stopped responding to the inputs the pilot gave it and instead deepened the dive, pulling toward the ground at a rate that left no time for recovery. Several Halifaxes were lost in circumstances that investigators initially found inexplicable. Then the pattern became too consistent to ignore. By 1943, the losses were not a statistical problem. They were a crisis. The test pilot Eric Brown, who had flown more different aircraft types than any other pilot alive and survived all of them, was assigned to investigate at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire. He flew deliberately induced corkscrew maneuvers in Halifax aircraft configured to match operational conditions, trying to trigger and document the fatal tendency on purpose in daylight, with the ground somewhere below him in the Wiltshire countryside. The results confirmed what the wreckage had been saying all along. The aircraft could enter a death spiral under conditions that any crew on any given night over Germany might encounter without warning. The fix was known. A redesigned tail fin, larger and rectangular rather than triangular, would correct the aerodynamic imbalance. The problem was that implementing it would disrupt the production line. There were contracts. There were delivery schedules. There were squadrons waiting for aircraft and targets on the list, and pressure from every direction to keep the numbers flowing. Handley Page hesitated. And crews continued to die in the meantime, some of them to enemy action, and some of them to an engineering compromise that had been retained past the point where anyone could honestly justify it. Into this situation walked Arthur Harris. He had taken command of Bomber Command in February of 1942, with a vision so clear and so total that it left almost no room for nuance. Everything in his command existed to destroy the industrial capacity of the Reich through overwhelming night bombing. Hundreds of heavy bombers, maximum bomb load, maximum altitude, concentrated streams over target. Harris believed in the Lancaster the way some men believe in a religion. It flew higher. It carried more. It was losing fewer aircraft per sortie. He made no secret of his preference, and he made no secret of his contempt for the Halifax. He called it inferior in official correspondence. He argued for its replacement. He pushed to convert the Halifax production lines to Lancaster production entirely. He was not entirely wrong about the early aircraft. The Mark I and Mark II Halifaxes were genuinely underperforming against the demands being placed on them. But Harris's contempt was communicated downward through the chain of command, with a force that damaged morale in Halifax squadrons and obscured something that was already beginning to change. The aircraft was not a failed design. It was an unfinished one. And the solution to what was unfinished was already in development in the workshops and on the drawing boards of people who had not given up on it. The Bristol Hercules was a 14-cylinder, two-row, air-cooled radial engine that operated on a sleeve valve system rather than the conventional poppet valves used in most aero engines of the era. It ran smoothly. It was resilient. It produced its power with far less internal drama than the Merlin. And crucially, it did not depend on a liquid cooling system. A single cannon shell piercing the Merlin's coolant lines could kill an engine within minutes over a target. The Hercules could absorb punishment that would stop a Merlin cold and keep turning. For a crew at 18,000 feet over the Ruhr with a night fighter somewhere behind them in the darkness, that difference was not a technical footnote. It was the margin between landing and not landing. The Mark III Halifax, powered by 4 Bristol Hercules, 16 engines producing 1,615 horsepower. Each entered service in November of 1943. Maximum speed climbed above 280 miles per hour at altitude. The service ceiling improved by nearly 3,000 feet. The rectangular tail fins, finally approved after Boscombe Down's findings could no longer be set aside, transformed the aircraft's handling entirely. The death spiral tendency was gone. Crews who had flown the Mark II on nerve and instinct now found an aircraft that responded cleanly and predictably to every input they gave it. Leonard Cheshire, one of Bomber Command's most celebrated pilots, and later a Victoria Cross recipient, had been among the first voices raising alarm about the original tail problem. He had sat in the right-hand seat during the Boscombe Down tests and watched Eric Brown perform the terrifying maneuvers that proved the danger. When the Mark III arrived at his squadron, Cheshire flew it and came back with a different understanding of what the aircraft actually was. He had fought for the fix. Now he was seeing the aircraft that should have existed from the beginning. By early 1944, Halifax Mark III squadrons were recording loss rates approaching those of the Lancaster. On some nights, they were better. Harris never fully recanted. But somewhere in the silence between his words and the numbers arriving on his desk, a different story was beginning to write itself. And it was being written in places that no headline would ever reach by crews who navigated at minimum altitude across occupied Europe in the dark, carrying passengers whose names they were never told toward fields identified by nothing more than 3 flashlights held by people who had chosen to resist. But that is what happens in Part 2. Because what the Halifax did over Germany was only the beginning of what it was capable of. And the mission that was about to begin in the spring of 1944 would require something that no bomber in the Royal Air Force had ever been asked to do before. In the autumn of 1943, the Halifax had survived everything the Air Ministry Arthur Harris and the Luftwaffe had thrown at it. The rectangular tail fins were approved. The Bristol Hercules engines were fitted. The death spiral was gone. Loss rates were falling. By any honest measure, the aircraft that had been condemned as inferior was beginning to prove what it could actually do. But proving it over Germany in a bombing stream was the easy part. The harder argument was the one nobody had thought to make yet, and it was about to be forced on a group of men who did not want to hear it. The Special Operations Executive had a problem that no bomb could solve. Across occupied Europe, resistance networks were forming in attics and barns and back rooms of pharmacies in cities where the wrong face at the wrong window could end a family. These networks needed people. Trained people, couriers, wireless operators, saboteurs, organizers, who could move between cells without being known, who could carry instructions that could not be written down and delivered to people who could not be contacted any other way. The agents existed. The training facilities existed. The problem was delivery. Getting a single human being alive and functional into a field in occupied France at 2 a.m, without alerting a German garrison, without injuring the agent on landing, without losing the aircraft or its crew, required a machine that the RAF had not built with that mission in mind. The Lancaster could not do it. Its bomb bay geometry made low-altitude parachute drops structurally awkward. The fuselage access was wrong. The aircraft was designed to carry destruction at high altitude, not people at low altitude, and the difference between those two missions was not a minor modification. It was a fundamentally different relationship between the aircraft and the earth below it. Group Captain Louis Hodges was the kind of officer who made decisions before he had permission to make them, which in wartime is either a court-martial or a career, depending entirely on whether you turn out to be right. Hodges had been tasked with building the operational capacity of 138 Squadron at RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire, one of 2 squadrons assigned exclusively to SOE insertion missions. He had looked at the aircraft available to him, flown several of them personally, and reached a conclusion that his superiors did not want to hear. "The Lancaster cannot do this work at the altitudes we need," he told Air Commodore Archie Boyle at a meeting in London in October of 1943. "The fuselage hatch geometry creates a rotation problem on exit. At 400 feet, a rotation problem is a fatality." Boyle set down his pen. "The Lancaster is the preferred heavy bomber of this command. With respect, sir, we are not bombing, we are posting letters, and the envelope has to arrive intact." The analogy did not land well. Boyle was not a man who responded well to analogies. He was a man who responded to doctrine. And doctrine said the Lancaster was the superior aircraft. And superior aircraft did not get replaced by inferior ones because a group captain found the hatch geometry inconvenient. Hodges was told to make the Lancaster work. He was told that Halifax allocation to Tempsford would not be increased. He was told that the conversation was finished. It was not finished. Because 48 hours later, Hodges received an unscheduled visit from a man named Colin Gubbins, the executive director of the SOE, who had heard about the meeting, and who had spent the previous 2 years watching agents die in circumstances that better delivery might have prevented. Gubbins did not outrank Boyle in the conventional sense, but Gubbins had the ear of people who outranked everyone in the conventional sense. And what he said to Hodges in a corridor at Tempsford was brief and direct. "Show me the numbers, not the doctrine, the numbers." Hodges had the numbers. He had been collecting them for 6 months because he had known this argument was coming, and he had known that doctrine would not yield to opinion. It yielded to data. The exit rotation problem on Lancaster drops at 400 feet was producing a ground impact angle deviation of between 15 and 22 degrees from vertical. In practical terms, that meant agents were hitting the ground at an angle instead of straight down, absorbing lateral force that damaged knees, ankles, and sometimes spines. Of the last 31 agents delivered by Lancaster on low-altitude drops, 9 had sustained injuries significant enough to compromise their first 72 hours of operational activity. 3 had been captured within a week of insertion, at least partly because their mobility was impaired. 1 had not survived the landing. The Halifax floor hatch sat in a different position relative to the aircraft's center of gravity, and the fuselage geometry produced a cleaner vertical exit. The aircraft's stable low-speed handling characteristics meant the pilot could hold it at 95 miles per hour at 400 feet without the control inputs fighting him, which was not something that could be said of the Lancaster at that altitude in that configuration. The Halifax could be slowed to a speed that gave the agent below an extra 2 seconds of parachute deployment time. 2 seconds at 400 feet is the difference between a controlled landing and a broken leg. Gubbins read the file. He did not speak for almost a minute. Then he said, "How many Halifaxes do you need?" The authorization came through in 3 weeks, which in bureaucratic terms was essentially instantaneous. 138 Squadron and 161 Squadron at RAF Tempsford were formally allocated Halifax aircraft for SOE insertion operations. The conversion training began immediately. The modification crews worked around the clock, fitting the floor hatches, removing bomb bay equipment, installing the static line anchors, and the dispatcher positions that allowed an agent to drop cleanly with a crew member, guiding the exit sequence. The aircraft that Bomber Command had been trying to sideline was now being handed a mission that no other aircraft could perform as well. The first full-scale operational test came on the night of November 14, 1943. 3 Halifaxes departed Tempsford at 10-minute intervals, each carrying a single agent and a load of supply containers destined for resistance networks in central France. The weather over the channel was poor. Cloud base at 800 feet, intermittent rain visibility, measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The kind of night that made navigation over featureless countryside a test of dead reckoning and nerve in equal measure. The first aircraft found its drop zone on the first pass. The agent exited cleanly. The supply containers followed on the count. The reception committee on the ground, 3 men with electric torches, standing in a field outside a village whose name the Halifax crew did not know and never asked, confirmed the reception with a prearranged signal. The second aircraft lost its drop zone in cloud, circled for 11 minutes, reacquired it, and delivered on the second pass. The third aircraft, experiencing a navigation instrument fault that would have turned a less experienced crew back toward England, pressed on, found the field using visual landmarks alone, and dropped with an accuracy that the ground team later reported as the best they had seen in 18 months of reception operations. 3 for 3. All agents delivered. All supply containers recovered. No aircraft lost. No crew casualties. No German response. The operation lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes, from wheels up to wheels down. The before and after comparison was not subtle. In the 12 months prior to the Halifax conversion, SOE insertion operations from Tempsford had recorded a successful delivery rate of 61%, accounting for aborted runs, missed drop zones, and agent injuries. In the 6 months following the conversion, the rate climbed to 83%. The injury rate on low-altitude drops fell by more than half. The number of agents who were operationally effective within 48 hours of insertion increased from roughly 60% to over 80%. These were not marginal improvements. In the context of operations where a single agent could change the intelligence picture for an entire region, the difference between 61% and 83% was measured in lives and in outcomes that would not appear in any document for decades. Hodges sent a brief report to Gubbins. Gubbins sent a brief note to the people who needed to know. Harris received a copy and filed it without comment. The Halifax production lines continued to run. But something else was beginning. The success at Tempsford was operational, contained, classified. The agents being delivered into France and Belgium and the Netherlands were invisible by definition. Their missions were not reported. Their successes were not announced. The networks they were building and supplying were operating in darkness that had to remain dark for them to function. The aircraft that was making all of this possible was equally invisible by the same logic and for the same reasons. And then, in the first weeks of 1944, word of a different kind of mission reached Chelmsford through channels that had nothing to do with agents or resistance networks. The planning for Operation Overlord was entering its final phase. The invasion of France was no longer a contingency. It was a schedule, and the schedule required something that made the SOE insertion problem look straightforward by comparison. The Allied High Command needed to deliver not one agent into a field at 400 feet. They needed to deliver an entire armored division. The aircraft that could carry a tank strapped inside a glider across the English Channel in darkness and release it accurately over a 500-meter landing zone behind enemy lines did not yet have a confirmed assignment. But there was only one aircraft in the Royal Air Force inventory capable of towing a Hamilcar glider loaded to 17 tons. Every planner who looked at the numbers arrived at the same answer. The Halifax had survived the bombing campaign. It had proven itself in the insertion role. Now it was being asked to do something that had never been attempted at this scale in the history of warfare. And 3 months before the most important morning of the 20th century, the men who would fly those missions did not yet know their aircraft was about to carry the weight of an entire invasion. By the spring of 1944, the Halifax had survived the men who wanted it canceled the engineering flaws that were killing its crews and the command culture that had written it off before it had finished becoming what it was meant to be. It had proven itself over Germany. It had proven itself over the Atlantic. It had delivered agents into occupied Europe with a precision that no other aircraft could match. But the argument about what the Halifax was capable of was about to be settled in a single night over a stretch of Norman coastline in an operation so large and so irreversible that there would be no room left for anyone to pretend it had not worked. The German High Command had noticed. That was the problem. By February of 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence had begun assembling a picture of what was happening at RAF Chelmsford and the surrounding stations in Bedfordshire. The pattern of night departures, the low-altitude flight profiles, the absence of bomb damage reports correlated with the sorties, all of it pointed towards something that was not a bombing campaign. German signals intelligence had been intercepting fragments of resistance network communications for months, and the acceleration in agent activity across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in late 1943 corresponded almost exactly with the expansion of Halifax operations at Chelmsford. The correlation was not proof, but it was enough to prompt action. In January of 1944, the Gestapo arrested 17 members of a resistance network in Lyon that had received 3 supply drops and 2 agents via Halifax insertion over the preceding 4 months. The network had been compromised by an informer, not by anything the aircraft had done wrong, but the arrests gave German intelligence their first direct evidence of the scope of what was being coordinated from England. The regional commander in Paris sent an urgent dispatch to Berlin. The dispatch noted that the British were using a heavy bomber in a role that no heavy bomber had previously been employed for, and that the operational results were significantly more effective than anything achieved by previous insertion methods. Berlin's response was to increase the density of night fighter patrols over the Loire Valley and the Dordogne, specifically targeting low-altitude contacts on southbound headings from England. In March of 1944, 2 Halifaxes on SOE missions were intercepted and shot down on the same night, the first losses of this type in the insertion role since the conversion from Lancaster. The crews were killed. The agents they were carrying did not survive. It was the worst single night Chelmsford had experienced since the program began. Group Captain Hodges received the loss reports at 6 in the morning and spent the next 4 hours rewriting the routing protocols for every scheduled operation in the following 2 weeks. He rerouted the approach corridors, adjusted the altitudes for the channel crossing, and requested an immediate increase in electronic countermeasures coverage from 100 group. The request was approved within 48 hours because by March of 1944 there was no longer any argument about whether the Halifax's SOE work was strategically important. The only argument was how to protect the aircraft doing it. But the night fighter threat was not the only pressure building. Inside the planning cells of SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a different kind of crisis was developing around the Halifax, and this one had nothing to do with enemy action. It had to do with a glider called the Hamilcar, and a question that nobody wanted to answer in writing. The Hamilcar could carry a Tetrarch light tank, or the equivalent weight in artillery and vehicles. Loaded it exceeded 17 tons. The tow aircraft required to get it airborne and across the channel and released accurately over a landing zone in Normandy in darkness had to provide enough sustained power to hold the combination stable through turbulence, rain, and anti-aircraft fire for up to 3 hours. The calculations had been run repeatedly by different teams, and they kept producing the same answer. Only the Halifax had the power, the stability, and the structural capacity to do it. But the Halifax crews who would fly these missions had never towed anything heavier than a Horsa in operational conditions, and the Horsa weighed less than half as much as a loaded Hamilcar. There were 11 weeks between the authorization of the glider towing assignments and the night of June 5th. The training program was compressed to a degree that made the instructors uncomfortable and the crews quietly terrified. Towing a 17-ton glider at low altitude in darkness required a form of discipline that was almost impossible to simulate on the ground. Any sudden bank steeper than 15 degrees risked snapping the tow rope. Any climb above the calculated tow angle could destabilize the glider behind. The pilot of the Halifax was essentially flying blind in 2 directions, simultaneously managing his own aircraft, while calculating the behavior of a machine he could not see and could only feel through the vibration of the cable attached to his tail. 4 crews washed out of the Hamilcar towing program in April. 2 more were reassigned after instructors determined that their instrument flying was not reliable enough for the conditions anticipated on the night of the operation. Nobody said out loud what the margins were. Everybody knew. June 5, 1944, 2300 hours. The Halifax crews of 38 Group took off from airfields across southern England in rain. The weather over the channel was worse than the meteorologists had predicted, and better than it would get before dawn. Each aircraft had a glider behind it. Each glider had men inside it who had been told that the next time their feet touched the ground, it would be in France, and everything that happened after that was up to them. The tow ropes were 150 feet long. The sky was black. The rain came horizontally across the cockpit glass. The pilots flew on instruments, holding airspeed, holding altitude, feeling the pull of the glider through the entire structure of the aircraft like a hand pressing back against them. The moment the airspeed varied more than 5 knots in either direction, the glider behind became unpredictable. The moment the altitude deviated more than 200 feet, the geometry of the release calculation changed. The pilots held their numbers. They held them for 2 hours and 40 minutes across the channel and over the Cotentin Peninsula toward landing zones with code names that would later become famous and were at that moment just coordinates on a map. Flak opened up below Caen. Orange bursts in the darkness close enough that the crews felt the concussion through the airframe. The formation did not break. The pilots held their headings. They held their speeds. The gliders behind them held their positions. The German gunners were firing at sounds and shapes and thermal signatures in a sky too dark and too full of aircraft to target accurately, but some of the rounds found targets anyway. 3 Halifaxes took hits over the Orne River Valley. 2 continued to their release points. 1 turned back with an engine on fire, the crew making the decision, in the time it took to assess the damage, releasing the glider early on, a heading that put it over cleared ground. The release sequence ran on schedule. Glider after glider slipped free. At the calculated point, the tow ropes fell away. The Halifaxes banked and climbed and turned northwest toward England, with their throttles forward, and their bomb bays empty, and their crews silent. Behind them in the darkness, men were landing in fields they had never seen in a country that had been occupied for 4 years in the hours before an army crossed the sea. The Hamilcar gliders delivered 6 Tetrarch tanks, 11 Bren gun carriers, and multiple artillery pieces to landing zones in the British airborne sector, in the first 90 minutes of June 6th. The armor was operational before dawn. It was engaging German positions before the seaborne forces had reached the beach. The bridge at Bénouville, which would become famous under a different name before the sun rose, was held in part because vehicles delivered by Halifax-towed Hamilcars were in position to support the paratroopers who had taken it in the dark. No other aircraft in the Royal Air Force had made that possible. The Lancaster could not tow the Hamilcar. The Sterling had been tried and found inadequate. The Halifax was the only answer to a question that the entire invasion plan depended on, and it had delivered without deviation from the assignment. The numbers, from the night of June 5th to 6th, told the story without requiring interpretation. 37 Hamilcar gliders were successfully towed to their release points by Halifax aircraft. 34 released on the primary coordinates. 3 released early due to aircraft damage, all on survivable headings. Casualty rates among the airborne troops delivered by Hamilcar were significantly lower than among troops delivered by lighter gliders, partly because the Hamilcar's structure offered more protection on impact, and partly because the armor and vehicles it carried gave the soldiers who climbed out of it an immediate tactical advantage. The German armored response to the British airborne landings in the Orne sector was delayed by more than 4 hours on the morning of June 6th. Post-war analysis attributed a significant portion of that delay to the presence of British armor in positions where German planners had not anticipated armor could be within 90 minutes of the initial landings. The Tetrarchs were not heavy tanks. They were not powerful enough to stop a panzer in a direct engagement. But they were present. They were mobile, and their presence forced German commanders to request reconnaissance and confirmation before committing their reserves because nobody had briefed them that the British could deliver tanks by air in the dark. Leonard Cheshire, flying a different type of mission that same night as a Pathfinder marker for the main bombing force, would later describe the hours of June 5th to 6th as the moment when everything the RAF had prepared for 2 years was tested simultaneously. The bombers were marking targets. The insertion aircraft were delivering agents who would sabotage road and rail lines behind the German front. The Halifaxes were towing the armor. And somewhere above all of it, the electronic warfare aircraft of 100 Group were flooding German radar frequencies with noise-creating phantom bomber streams, buying time and confusion for everything happening below them. The Halifax was present in every layer of that operation. Not the Lancaster, not a single aircraft type. The one that Harris had called inferior was flying in 4 distinct roles on the most important night of the European war. George Volkert received no communication about any of this. He was in Cricklewood in the Handley Page design offices working on the next problem. He had designed the aircraft. What it did with itself afterward was someone else's story to tell. But there was one more chapter that nobody had anticipated. And it was waiting in the cold water of a Norwegian lake, where an aircraft that had been declared surplus and scheduled for scrapping was about to become the only evidence that any of this had happened at all. The Halifax had crossed the channel with tanks behind it. It had placed agents in fields that no map acknowledged. It had jammed radar systems that were killing the crews of aircraft that received all the credit. By the summer of 1944, the aircraft that Arthur Harris had called inferior was flying in more operational roles simultaneously than any other aircraft in the Allied arsenal. The question that nobody had thought to ask yet was a simple one. What happened to the man who built it? And what happened to the aircraft itself when the war decided it no longer needed either of them? George Volkert received a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 1945 New Year's Honours List. The citation was brief. It noted his contributions to aircraft design in general terms. It did not name the Halifax specifically. It did not reference the 82,773 bombing sorties or the agents delivered into occupied Europe or the Hamilcar gliders towed across the Channel on the night that changed the shape of the war. It was the kind of recognition that a government gives to a man it respects, but has not fully decided how to celebrate delivered in language that would mean very little to anyone who did not already know what it was for. Volkert was 53 years old when the war ended. He had spent the previous 6 years watching his aircraft be criticized, modified, criticized, again nearly cancelled, saved by its own operational record, and then quietly vindicated by numbers that were not allowed to be published. He returned to his desk at Handley Page in Cricklewood and continued working. He was not a man who required an audience for his grief or his satisfaction. He had designed the aircraft. It had done what he believed it could do. That was in his understanding the complete transaction. The men who had flown it did not always share his composure about how history was treating the machine. Leonard Cheshire, who had flown the Halifax in its most dangerous early configuration, and had sat beside Eric Brown during the Boscombe Down tests that proved the tail fin was killing crews, received the Victoria Cross in 1944 for a cumulative record of operational excellence that spanned multiple aircraft types. He never stopped mentioning the Halifax when he spoke about the war. He understood with the particular clarity of a man who had nearly died in a poorly designed aircraft and survived to fly the corrected version what the difference between the Mark II and the Mark III actually meant in human terms. He understood it as a debt that had not been adequately acknowledged. Arthur Harris published his memoirs in 1947. The Lancaster received extensive treatment. The Halifax appeared in the context of its early failures. The remarkable operational record of the Mark III, the SOE missions, the glider towing the electronic warfare role, the submarine patrols over the Bay of Biscay. None of these received the weight they deserved in a document written by the man who had tried to have the aircraft removed from service. Harris was not dishonest. He was incomplete. And incompleteness, when it concerns the record of men who died in a specific aircraft over a specific city on a specific night, is a form of erasure that compounds over decades. The Halifax was declared surplus to requirements in 1947. The scrapping began almost immediately. Aircraft that had flown through flak over the Ruhr, that had dropped agents into France at 400 feet, that had towed Hamilcars across the Channel, in rain and darkness were broken up at depots across Britain with an efficiency that would have seemed almost vindictive if it had not simply been economics. Metal was valuable in post-war Britain. Sentiment was not. By 1952, fewer than a handful of complete examples remained, and those were deteriorating in storage rather than being preserved with any serious intent. The Handley Page. Halton, a civilian conversion of the Halifax airframe, flew cargo routes across Africa and the Middle East in the immediate post-war years. 41 Haltons participated in the Berlin airlift of 1948 and 1949, carrying food and coal into a city under Soviet blockade, a final operational chapter for a design born in wartime urgency. It was quiet, unglamorous work that suited the aircraft's reputation perfectly. The Halifax had never done anything with ceremony. It had simply done what was required of it in conditions that made the requirement almost impossible, with a consistency that the historical record only grudgingly acknowledges. Volkert continued at Handley Page until 1948, guiding the transition from wartime production to peacetime transport design. When he finally left the company he had joined 36 years earlier, he did so without a press release or a farewell ceremony that anyone recorded for posterity. He retired to a quiet life and lived with characteristic precision and longevity until 1978. He was 86 years old. He had outlived most of the men who had flown his aircraft. He had outlived most of the men who had criticized it. He had watched the Lancaster become the symbol of bomber command in every museum, every documentary, every national remembrance. He had watched the Halifax disappear from public memory with a completeness that would have been difficult to explain to anyone who understood what the aircraft had actually done. The technical legacy of what the Halifax pioneered in the SOE insertion role did not disappear with the aircraft. The operational principles that Hodges had fought to establish at Tempsford, the use of heavy aircraft for low-altitude precision delivery of personnel, the modification of standard military platforms for specialized insertion roles, the integration of aircraft performance data with agent safety outcomes became foundational to the way Western intelligence services thought about clandestine air operations for the next 4 decades. The methods used in the Korean War to insert special forces behind North Korean lines were direct descendants of the Tempsford Protocols. The aircraft changed. The principles did not. When the SAS and the American Special Operations Forces developed their modern insertion doctrines in the 1960s and 1970s. The lineage ran back through several layers of classified operational history to a converted farmhouse in Bedfordshire, and a group captain who had argued with an air commodore about hatch geometry. The electronic warfare role that the Halifax pioneered in 100 Group also outlasted the aircraft by generations. The concept of dedicated electronic warfare platforms flying within or alongside strike formations to suppress and deceive enemy radar networks became one of the defining features of modern air power doctrine. Every EA-18G Growler that accompanies a strike package in the 21st century is performing a mission that was first systematically developed at scale by Halifax crews flying mandrel jamming equipment over Germany in 1943 and 1944. The Halifax did not invent electronic warfare, but it was the first heavy bomber to be comprehensively adapted for it as a primary role, and the operational lessons learned in 100 Group shaped every subsequent development in that field. The bravery required to pursue an idea past the point where every institution around you has decided it is finished is not a quality that military history tends to celebrate in engineers. It celebrates it in commanders, in pilots, in soldiers who hold positions against impossible odds. The quiet persistence of a man who continues to refine a design while the most powerful figure in his operational chain is arguing for its cancellation, who absorbs the criticism and keeps working because the work is what he believes in. That form of courage does not produce the kind of story that gets told at ceremonies. It produces aircraft. It produces the gap between what the specification demanded and what the machine eventually became. And that gap in the case of the Halifax was the difference between an aircraft that killed its crews and an aircraft that delivered them home. The institutions that resisted the Halifax's development were not uniquely corrupt or unusually short-sighted. They were operating according to the logic of their own experience, which is what institutions always do. The lesson is not that they were wrong to have standards or wrong to demand proof. The lesson is that proof takes time, and time in wartime costs lives, and the men paying that cost are never the men making the institutional decisions. Harris was not on a Halifax over Nuremberg in March of 1944. The crews who were had not been consulted about the decision to keep flying an aircraft with a known fatal handling flaw, while the production line adjusted to the fix. Two comparable stories from the same war make the pattern clear. The proximity fuse developed in absolute secrecy by a team that the American military establishment initially considered a waste of resources eventually increased anti-aircraft kill rates by a factor that changed the entire calculus of air defense. The Norden bombsight, by contrast, received enormous institutional investment and produced results in operational conditions that were significantly below what the testing environment had suggested, because institutional confidence had outrun operational reality. The difference between these outcomes was not primarily about the quality of the engineering. It was about whether the people driving the development were allowed to respond to evidence or required to defend decisions already made. Now for the detail that almost nobody knows. Halifax W1048. The aircraft recovered from Lake Höklingen in Norway in 1973. The one that had been hit by anti-aircraft fire during a raid on the battleship Tirpitz on April 28, 1942, and had sunk through the ice of a fjord-fed lake and rested undisturbed for 31 years, was examined in detail after its recovery by the RAF Museum. Inside the fuselage in a storage compartment near the wireless operator's position, the recovery team found a thermos flask. It was military-issue standard fit, the kind carried on every operational Halifax sortie. The flask was intact. The contents had long since become something that was not coffee in any recognizable sense, But it was there, 31 years under cold, fresh water, and the ordinary object that a crew member had brought on a mission that ended in a Norwegian lake was still in the place where he had left it. The crew had survived. They had escaped through the ice. They had been captured and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. The aircraft had gone down and stayed down and preserved that small evidence of their presence for longer than most of the men involved in the Halifax program had lived. It is displayed now at the RAF Museum at Hendon unrestored in the condition in which it was found, every dent and stress fracture a record of what it endured. It is one of 2 surviving Halifaxes on Earth. The other is the one recovered from 250 meters of cold water in Lake Mjosa in Norway in 1995, the only fully restored example in existence on display at the National Air Force Museum of Canada at CFB Trenton in Ontario, because there was no other way to find one. Every Halifax that had served over Germany and France and the Atlantic and the Dutch canals had been cut up for scrap before anyone decided they were worth keeping. From a converted farmhouse in Fulham to the drawing offices of Cricklewood, to the flack fields above the Ruhr and the dark fields of occupied France and the cold water of Norwegian lakes, George Volkert's aircraft flew 82,773 sorties, delivered agents who helped collapse enemy networks across a continent, towed the armor that reached Normandy before the infantry, and jammed the radar that was killing the crews. Everyone else was busy celebrating. The Lancaster got the monuments, the Halifax got the job done, and the quiet engineer who designed it, who absorbed the criticism and kept working and never required an audience for his conviction, left behind the only proof that mattered. Not a medal, not a memoir. An aircraft found at the bottom of a lake with a thermos flask still in its place, waiting for someone to come looking. That is what it looks like when a man builds something that actually works. If you know a story like this one, a name that history forgot, an aircraft or a weapon, or an idea that changed the outcome of something important and received no credit for doing it, leave it in the comments. There are hundreds of these stories inside the Second World War alone, and most of them are still waiting at the bottom of cold water somewhere perfectly preserved for someone to decide they are worth the dive.